a Montana native who was instrumental in the fight to track down Osama bin Laden and other terrorists like Zarqawi. You may have seen her featured in the recent HBO documentary Manhunt. Nada Bakos, a Denton, Montana native, now has a new book out, The Targeter, My Life in the CIA, Hunting Terrorists and Challenging the White House. Nada, it's great to get a chance to be able to talk to you again. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I haven't, unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but I know it just came out. What are you most excited about in this book that you've put together?
Well, it's been a long time coming. It has been in the review process with the government for a little over 3 years. So I'm excited just to have it out to start with. But really what I wanted to convey in this book is give people a sense of what it's like to be at, the mid to lower senior level working at the CIA. I think we hear so much from political appointees and from senior level officers, and I just wanted to give the public a sense of what it's like to be the person who's there day in and day out doing the actual work.
So tell us a little bit more of your story. You grew up basically on, out in farm country, Denton, Montana. You were kind of working just like a normal office job, and then you end up joining the CIA. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up making it to the CIA.
Yeah, I grew up in Denton. I have one older brother. My parents both grew up on a farm in Denton also. And so I have many generations on one side that's been in that area for a long time. And I just really wanted to work overseas and live overseas for a while. When I was younger, I was really fascinated just by travel and other cultures in general. So it was just sort of a natural segue for me to look for an international job. But with the CIA, I actually just found an ad in an Economist in the late 90s, and then I went ahead and applied online.
And I know a lot of folks have seen the movie Zero Dark 30, and of course Hollywood's going to do what Hollywood's going to do. So sometimes it's not always an accurate portrayal of things. But you were actually one of the analysts, one of the targeters, not only tracking Zarqawi, the Al Qaeda operative in Iraq back in the mid 2000s, but you were also on the manhunt for Osama bin Laden, and one of the folks who was really instrumental in the fight to track down Osama bin Laden. In fact, I know some have hypothesized that maybe you were the woman that Jessica Chastain was featuring in that movie.
Right. Well, spoiler, I'm not. There was a group of people who were instrumental in that, but it takes a broad scope of teams over multiple years to be able to do that type of work. So Hollywood has to narrow it down to a few people because that makes a great story, and it would be impossible to hire that many actors to be accurate. At the same time, there was a portion of what I did in my job that helped lead to bin Laden. It was part of getting the courier name. It just happened to be somebody that we targeted that was coming into Iraq from Al Qaeda, and we ended up arresting him along with the Kurds in northern Iraq, and he gave us the name, the nom de guerre of the courier for bin Laden, and confirmed that he existed. So that was a nugget in the piece of the hunt for bin Laden, and my book goes into some of that in addition to the entire scale of the war effort of the Iraq invasion, because I was actually on the team as an analyst initially evaluating whether Iraq had anything to do with 9/11 and Al-Qaeda at the CIA, and we found that they did not, even before the invasion, and that was all communicated to the policymakers as well.
Yeah, and so in the book there'll be some interesting aspects to read about part of how you were pushing back against the then Bush White House about the entry into the Iraq War and things like that. Talk about stepping back to the bin Laden story here too. I mean, especially for those, we've got so many Montanans who served in the military and maybe other government agencies, people that we don't even know that served, you know what I mean, but quietly and served without even maybe their family even knowing what they were doing, like in capacities that you were in. Well, when we finally got Osama bin Laden, what that was like, because 9/11 was, was kind of our generation's Pearl Harbor, and so many wanted to step up and serve and did serve. And so what was it like when you finally got Osama bin Laden for you?
Well, for me, I had left the agency by then. I was actually trying to figure out if I wanted to go private sector or stay in the government, so I was on a sabbatical. But I had a friend call me and tell me to pay attention to the news, and so I heard it like everyone else did on the TV. And, just like the culmination of when Zarqawi was killed, knowing and understanding that this isn't end extremism by removing one individual. Extremism is an ideology that can be embraced by a whole host of people. It doesn't matter what color or what part of the world they come from. And knowing it wouldn't end that, but at the same time, it was a symbolic end to the devastation that happened on 9/11 and to some of our colleagues in post-Afghanistan.
The other thing I've heard about your new book, and for those just joining us, we're talking with Nada Bakos, a Denton, Montana native who is instrumental in the fight to track down Osama bin Laden and other terrorists like Zarqawi. She's got a new book out, The Target, or My Life in the CIA, Hunting Terrorists and Challenging the White House. The other thing that I've heard about your book is you really pay tribute and kind of give insight into just not only the sacrifices made by women in this war on terror, but also some of the challenges that they face in the midst of this fight, just overcoming some of those cultural hurdles and things like that. And, like, for example, earlier this year, there was this incredible story about Navy cryptologist Shannon Kent. And, she was killed in an ISIS attack in Syria. But just, I never met her, but just a remarkable story. She spoke 7 different languages. She was working in a special operations task force. And just but there's probably, countless women like her and you that we just never even hear about.
Right. I mean, historically, if you look at the books that were available, they were largely for men as well. So that was another reason I thought I wanted to write this, is because I want other young women to know that they have a role in national security alongside of men and that their voice matters. And then the fact that we have just diversity of thought matters, because if we approach everything from always one single point of view, that's when we fall apart as a country.
Yeah. So what are some of the stories that you share in your book about specifically being a woman and in the national security arena? On the analyst side at the CIA, which is where I started, it's all judged based on your capability. So how well you can write and brief policymakers and your capability to analyze and digest all of the information that's coming. So it doesn't matter on that side of the house. Where I ran up against a few walls was on the operations side, because it was still in this sort of paradigm of the Cold War and post-World War II, where it was just this, mostly men as case officers. The case officers were the pointy end of the spear on the operations side. Because in the analyst side, the analysts are also at the pointy end of the spear. They're the ones that are taking everything, the culmination of it. So, as a woman, especially not in an operations officer role, I ran up against walls once in a while. Sometimes I was the only woman sitting in some of these senior meetings. So it was a bit more challenging on that side. I think it's evolved since then, because there's now a woman that's the head of operations. There's also a woman in charge of the entire CIA. So I think the culture itself is shifting. Nada Bakos is, of course, a Denton, Montana native. Also went to Montana State University. So there's actually a great write-up done a number of years ago by a Montana State University publication. Ann Cantrell wrote that, called On Target. But I like this write-up that they use, where Nada Bakos describes her time in the CIA as a mix between James Bond movies and The Office television show. That's kind of a funny description. Yeah, how would you describe those two, Nada Bakos?
Well, I get the question a lot on whether or not the CIA is like any of the Hollywood shows or any of the movies. And I would have to say there's not one that comes extremely close. Homeland there's some stuff within the operations piece, and once in a while kind of resembles, but for the most part it's not super close. But one of the fascinating shows, I think, as far as like the detail and the tediousness and the operations piece of it is the Americans. I think that one actually is a little bit more analogous. On what the characters go through is a totally separate issue.
Yeah, that's an interesting show. Well, we've only got a few minutes left here, but I know your book. I'm looking forward to checking it out myself. It's kind of cool too because I think I've seen your tweets over the years, and I know that my friend Rob O'Neill is probably a little more to the right. You might be a little more to the left, but you both serve your country in incredible ways, regardless. And so it's cool to hear both of your stories. From your perspective, talk about, I guess, some of the national security debates that you bring up in this book. I know, you talk about pushing back against the Bush White House, and even still today, there's always internal debates. Where maybe some in the Trump administration want to be more aggressive against Iran, and then President Trump is not wanting to be as aggressive. How do you read all of these national security debates?
So one of the things that I would stress is while you're inside the CIA, your personal opinion and beliefs, wherever they are, whatever political leaning you have, doesn't matter. You have to be objective. So what you're really doing is just relaying facts and analysis. But when I look at some of the rhetoric about Iran right now, I see analogies, and I think publicly what we need to demand is we need to see some declassified evidence of whether or not there really is an escalating threat with Iran. Because right now, the 3 channels that the CENTCOM commander actually talked about are channels of threat escalation that Iran has been using for decades. So whether or not they're escalating within those channels, that doesn't mean that there's an imminent threat. That means that there is still a game of cat and mouse that they're playing with us. And we're also being provocative in that sense as well. So I do see some analogies with some of the rhetoric around Iran.
Do you see, in a couple minutes left here before we're done, unfortunately, but do you see just the reforms that are beginning to take place in the Arab world that are starting to take place? Of course, that's more the Saudi side, but then the Iranian side, you've had women leading these protests. I think it was like White Wednesdays or something like that. Are we starting to see some monumental reforms begin to take place and maybe even slightly a revolution in that part of the world?
Well, there are some reforms. We've seen, some lessening of the restrictions for women in Saudi. They're able to move much more freely. They're actually in workplaces where they haven't been before and contributing in ways that they hadn't been for a long time. Iran, and the restrictions in Iran, especially for women, are mostly around clothing. But so as far as the culture and dealing with the authoritarian regime in Iran, I think there's still a long way for people to go. But I do see some subtle shifts, but I also see, authoritarians and dictators rising up to power because when there's not an infrastructure in place to build a democracy, it's really difficult to build that and keep people who are really attracted to power out of those positions.
Well, Nada Bakos, it's always great to talk with you, and I know we'd love to hear more. Fortunately, folks can read more. Your book, The Targeter, about your life in the CIA, I understand it's now available. Keep us posted if you do a book signing back here in Montana. We'll share that news with folks. What's the best way for them to get their hands on it now?
Wherever they would like. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, ask for it at your local bookstore. Thank you.